Greetings! In this video, I'm going to be going over how I do my basing typically. I've been doing this off camera for my videos for ages now, with a pop-up card directing people to my video on the Storm Speeder, which was the last time I did basing properly on camera. Most people have cards off, and that's fine, though I figured it'd be good to go over the full process in a dedicated video anyway. I'll be doing this in 4 parts. First, I'm starting with the White Templar that I did last week, which I'll show the full process. Then I'll do some smaller minis in the second part with some extra details. Then an Invictus Warsuit, showing how I do bigger bases with rocks, grass and rusty metal on the base. The last part will be the Varnishing, as that's a point worth considering in itself. So let's get started. Alright, here's the White Templar I made for my previous video. You know the base is covered with white paint, which may show up in little gaps in the basing material later, so I like to use Rhinox hide to undercoat the surface. If there are any gaps, they'll be less noticeable, especially compared to seeing little white dots peeking through. It's not necessary to get a smooth coat, it's going to be mostly covered anyway. Just make sure this is fully dry before the next step, otherwise you might remove some. Next is putting down some PVA glue. The brand doesn't matter, I got this one from VMS and honestly I don't see a difference compared to the cheap no-name brands in hardware stores. As long as it's thin for craft hobbies, you should be good to go. I put a blob down and spread it around with a plastic applicator. This old Games Workshop one works fine for this, but a toothpick or similar tool works just as well. I should say though, make sure you wait a few hours after using enamel products, as the thinners involved there can cause the basing material to stick to the model itself. For oil paints, you may even need to varnish the model before. Though I've not had much success with oil paints in general, so I'm not certain how they'll behave here. Anyway, filling the entire base is important, and cleaning the edge of the base with a finger is a simple way to prevent the material flowing over. Now for the basing material itself. This is the Scrublands base ready mix from Geek Scenics. My favourite due to how versatile the contents are. The older version had little bushes in it, but the new mix has a lot less of that, which I appreciate as they were a bit weird looking. I've emptied a few of them into this larger container with a sealing lid. After applying the PVA glue, I simply dip the model into the mixture, spinning it around and then tapping off some of the excess. It should grip on fairly quickly, though depending on the PVA glue you're using, you might let it sit for a few seconds before lifting it out. This one came out pretty good on the first try. The one in the second part I had to clean up afterwards. Now for the base trim. I've switched entirely to this black paint marker from AK Interactive for this. After waiting half hour for the basing materials to set enough to be handled like this, I painted in the trim. I do 2 or 3 coats depending on how the coverage looks. Over bits with white like this, 3 coats tends to be better. It usually dries by the time I finish 1 lap of the rim, so 3 spins and it's done. Now for a different example. This is a Solar Auxilia model with a smaller 28mm base. It's the same process here, just on a smaller base with more detail to watch out for. There's a bit of blue in this base, so the Rhinox hide undercoat will help prevent any of those bits of blue sticking through the basing material if there's a gap. This Servo Skull gets the same treatment, also on a 28mm base, but the profile of the Mini here shows the base clearer than the others. Like with the Space Marine, I use a bit of PVA glue and spread it around with the applicator. If I put too much on, I scoop it up and blob it over to the next Mini in the queue, or some tissue paper if there's no others. Here we have the same dipping method as I used for the Space Marine, though there was a bit of glue on the edge of the base that I missed. Wiping the edge with the finger and sprinkling the basing material back into the container works well to clean this up. I do another dip afterwards just to make sure there's nothing missing on the edge after the wipe. The Servo Skull was done in the same way, though there's a fair bit more glue here. More glue means a taller finish after the dip. So for standing models, it's good to have a shallow pass, just so it doesn't look like they're sinking in. I placed a rock on this one manually, then carefully dipped to the base to get the smaller bits to surround it, without pushing it around. Next is the base trim. Again, after waiting for the basing material to set enough. We don't want it falling off and leaving gaps. The smaller the base, the more likely the first pass will still be wet, so you may need to wait a minute or so for the next pass, then you'll be good to go. Now for the third example, an Invictus Warsuit, starting with Rhinox hide like the others. For this base I've used some crushed slate rocks, some skulls which I've already painted, and some various bits kindly donated by my 2 dogs manipulating my property. Painting the rocks in a tone that matches the basing method can be a bit tricky, but I've managed to come up with a recipe that suits the Scrublands material that I use. Each of the rocks received a base coat with Steel Legion Drab. When there's this many, I've been considering alternating colours for certain rocks, but it's worked out so far without doing that. A rough highlight is done with Baneblade Brown over the edges, but also along any bits that stick out. Dry brushing can work well here too. The idea is just to get some depth on the rocky material. Note these nicely shaped chunks of vase, which was the result of one of my dogs sleeping against a large vase, which was surprisingly fragile when tipped over. A final highlight is done with Rakarth flesh, doing little dots and such all over the highest points of the rocks. You can be very particular and do each one by hand like this, or go a bit rougher and just blob it around as if bits have been chipped off and it's dusty as a result. We can even use a dry brush approach, like I did on the side of these broken vase chunks. Now for this cap from a pen or marker. I'm not sure what it was. This was painted with exhaust manifold earlier, but now I'm using Typhus Corrosion all over it, and that ring thing behind it. This paint has some grit in it that gives it some texture when it's dry, but before it dries I use some water to thin it around the dome part, which should keep it somewhat transparent, showing some of the silver through. For the orange rust effect, I lightly applied some Skrag brown over the texture. This is almost a dry brush method, but it's only lightly applied. I focus around the top bit where the hole is, around the rim of the dome, and then around most of the sides. This way we get a nice transition from the visible steel to the rusty finish, which I think is in a plausible position. To increase the brightness of the rust a bit, I use some Trollslayer orange over the most prominent sections of rust, adding some more saturation to the effect. Now for some grass tufts. My preference is the dry green coloured tufts from Gamer's Grass. I found that the Gamer's Grass tufts yield the most number of tufts for the price, at least compared to other brands at local suppliers here. Other brands might be cheaper in your location. I use some angled tweezers to apply them. These tufts have a sticky underside, and using the pointy ends of the tweezers to push down little bits through the grass works well to set them in place. I apply a few of these 6mm ones on the larger bases like this, but there are smaller ones available for more detailed work. Now for the PVA glue. This can be complicated with the grass, but I found it's easier to make a mess of the grass by covering the edges a bit, instead of applying the grass on top of the glue. If you do put them on at the same time as the base material, they might slide around because they're fairly light and big, and the material is going to get between the grass either way, so whilst this might be a bit trickier to apply, it's easier in the long run for me. Unlike the infantry models, I only do small sections at a time before dipping. PVA glue dries too quickly to do the entire base in one go, especially if you're going carefully. To apply the base material, I dip the edge of the base in first, then sprinkle further material on by hand. There's going to be a mess on the grass, but once it dries, I go in with the tweezers and pick out individual blades that were problematic or break off the attached material, whichever happens first. Another application of PVA glue here. Trying to worm it in around the details is a challenge, but it's fairly forgiving to clean up if you need to. A brush with a bit of water will clean any bits that you're concerned about, but I usually don't worry. Sprinkling a bunch of the base material here in the middle, as well as dipping the edges like before. Just keep repeating until you're happy with it. Now for the base rim. This base is fairly big, so 3 spins and it's ready to go. On to the last step for all of the examples now, varnishing. I airbrush ultramatte varnish onto the bases in quite a heavy spray. You can see the shine of the wet varnish for an example of how thick I apply it. This close-up should give a rough example too. The idea is that when it dries, it'll both reduce any plastic shine you get from the grass, but it'll also hold everything together a bit stronger than just PVA glue. If you're using a spray can varnish, be careful not to overdo it, as you might get a frosting effect. Otherwise, you can try thin PVA glue followed by a light varnish with a spray can. And here we have it! Some finished bases. I like the look of these, especially for the time it takes to do them. Sure, you can do bases with basing texture and a bunch of paints, but I like the mix that I've got here. I know some people finish painting their model and then lose steam by having to do the base. Some may think this is low effort, and yeah, I guess it is, but I personally see basing as the background, and having a believable but forgettable base is good for tying the whole piece together. It's personal preference, like everything in this hobby. There are of course other brands for basing materials like this. I've been wanting to try kraut cover for example, but I haven't found a good local supplier. International shipping costs are quite expensive these days. But anyway, hopefully this video helps some of you guys, and hope you stick around for my next video.